Before we move on to Book 2, let's take a look at our authors, RODMAN, PHILBRICK, and Lynn Hartnett. RODMAN PHILBRICK got his start writing adult fiction, writing a lot of mystery and suspense novels in the 80s before breaking into young adult literature in 1993 with Freak the Mighty, which I have not read, but based on its description, it's one of those really sad books about how everyone's different, and that's okay, but those differences will also kill you. The book was very successful, getting adapted into film in 1998 called The Mighty because we can't have freak in the title, despite it being contextually appropriate. Since that success, PHILBRICK seems to have been splitting his time fairly evenly between young adult and old adult literature, including a series of 3 horror trilogies, of which The Werewolf Chronicles is the second. The first being The House on Cherry Street in 1995, and the last being Visitors in 1997. Lynn Hartnett's career was mostly in journalism, being assistant editor for Business Digest, editor for New Hampshire Profiles, and editor and co-founder of a newspaper supplement called Kid Writers Monthly. Hartnett never had any books solely credited to her. She helped co-write the 3 aforementioned trilogies and one standalone in 1998 called Abduction. However, she wrote an impossible amount of book reviews, both in print and online. There are more than 1,300 reviews written by her on Amazon alone. Sadly, Hartnett passed away last year due to cancer. Now, you know me. You know the amount of research I like to put into these videos, and since so little information on the Werewolf Chronicles is out there, I took a stab at contacting RODMAN PHILBRICK, and he replied. He had this to say about the series. 1994. A year or so after Scholastic published Freak the Mighty, my first book for middle school readers, Jean Faywell, then one of the great creative powerhouses at Scholastic, thought it might be interesting to see what I could do with a mass-market scary story for kids. Her thinking was that before I'd published a literary novel with Scholastic, Freak the Mighty, I'd written quite a few mass-market, paperback original adult thrillers. I agreed to give it a whirl, provided that the writing duties and credit could be shared with my spouse and partner, the journalist and editor Lynn Hartnett. This would give me the time and space to continue working on serious novels for young readers, or that was my thinking. Lynn and I had once ghosted an adult true crime story for Stackpole Books, and had worked well together, and thought it might be fun to write a scary tale for kids. Jean Faywell had a notion for a haunted house trilogy. Indeed, she had the title The House on Cherry Street. No story suggestions, just the series title. What we did with it was entirely up to us. The way it worked was that Lynn and I would hash out a general plot. This was my strength, and then I would write a chapter-by-chapter synopsis, the events of a chapter described in a paragraph or less. And then Lynn would write the first draft, and we'd both work on a polished draft. Many of the classic haunted house elements in The House on Cherry Street came from Lynn, who was a great fan of Shirley Jackson, as well as 19th century Gothic novels, and usually involved a spooky house with a secret. The marketing was all Scholastic. They had, and have, a great team of designers and freelance cover artists, as well as access to zillions of book fairs and book clubs, where new titles and series could be featured and sold more or less directly to the intended audience. The books were featured prominently in catalogs, brochures, and counter and standalone book displays. Bethany Buck, now I think with Simon & Schuster, was the series editor for all 3 trilogies. I'm ashamed to say that I can't recall the name of the designer, who was crucial to the enterprise. She was with Scholastic for a number of years, and for all I know may still be there. Bethany would remember. Lynn and I came up with the idea and title for the Werewolf Chronicles. Our first thought had been an attempt at a middle school vampire story, but that was shot down. At the time, it was generally understood that as scary as a book might be for 4th graders, little or no blood would actually be shed on the page, and vampires were all about blood. So the next creature from classical horror seemed obvious to Lynn and me, a werewolf. Some of the notions came from my recollections of Kipling's Mowgli stories, a feral child essentially raised by animals, in this case raised by wolves. The first thing we did, Lynn and I, was come up with the rules of the wearing. It seemed important that creatures like werewolves, or vampires for that matter, would have certain rules that would apply. They gave the story an internal structure and logic. The great thing about editors like Jean and Bethany is that once the general idea was agreed upon, A werewolf? Sounds like fun. Go for it. The execution of the idea was entirely up to the writers. Of the 3 trilogies, this was the one we were the proudest of in terms of characters and atmosphere. Naturally, it sold the least copies, and as far as I know is currently out of print. The last trilogy, Visitors, was inspired by the cheesy but scary, fun 1950s sci-fi movies Lynn and I had both grown up on. After the 3rd trilogy was out there for a few months, they had sold reasonably well but were not blockbusters, Bethany suggested we try a standalone for a slightly older audience. That became Abduction. I believe it was Lynn who suggested the idea of a pair of teens abducted by aliens, but it could have been something Bethany Buck suggested. However it evolved, I helped with the chapter outlines and plotting, but Lynn did all the heavy lifting, writing-wise, and came up with most of the characters. As to whether we'd have made any changes if we were writing the Werewolf Chronicles today, that's difficult to say. Lynn died last year, age 61 of cancer. Given the success for series like Twilight, maybe we'd have written it for a slightly more mature audience rather than for 4th and 5th grade readers that were, at the time, dominating the marketplace with series like Goosebumps, Animorphs, and so on. More romance, and if that was the case it would have been all Lynn because my talents don't extend to teen romance. It's pretty enlightening, and this puts me in that uncomfortable position of having very friendly, helpful contacts with the creator of a work that I'm pretty negative about. Mr. PHILBRICK, if we should ever meet, you can break 2 or fewer fingers. My treat. In the meantime, let's get into the Werewolf Chronicles Book 2, Children of the Wolf. So in the last book, we're introduced to Gruff, a 12-year-old boy who was raised by wolves, then discovered he was a werewolf just in time to meet a bunch of no-good werewolves hanging around the forest near a small town. The werewolves steal a baby and place the blame on the wolves, resulting in the wolves making a run for it and Gruff getting captured and put in the care of the Parker family. But surely this is only a temporary situation, right? Then, one evening, Mrs. Parker announced that social services had been unable to locate my parents and that I would stay with the Parkers, if it was all right with me. Yeah, I mean, he is a child who spent a decade being raised by wolves, a gold mine for child psychiatry research, and is probably unable to adjust to a modern society, let alone a modern family unit. But we're really tired, and we don't really want to deal with it right now. You go ahead and keep him, our treat. Here's a bit of reality for you. There is actually no substantial reports of a child being raised by wolves, or really raised exclusively by any other wild animal. Some of the most famously reported cases of children raised by wolves were later revealed to be hoaxes, the most prominent example being Amala and Kamala, 2 Indian children from the 1920s who, in reality, were most likely severely autistic and taken advantage of by an asshole. Remember, this was a time when freak shows were still a thing and money could still be made off of sick shit like this. A year after the Werewolf Chronicles was released, a Belgian woman by the name of MISHA she's a fucking liar, I don't care. She published a book claiming to be her memoirs, detailing her going into hiding during the Holocaust and winding up living with a pack of wolves. This, too, was revealed to be a hoax in 2008. That's not a criticism in using the raised by wolves trope in a work of fiction. I'm not standing here and taking a piss on the Jungle Book. But if you're going to bring something real-worldy like social services into this, then you got to play the game. While children raised by animals isn't really a thing, feral children are. Children that have received severe neglect, abuse, and isolation from society. Children like Jeannie, who spent her first 13 years of her life locked in a room without a word spoken to her. Children in these sad situations have a very difficult time attaining what's considered normal behavior, having to learn walking, toilet training, and most especially speaking from scratch. People in this situation usually spend years, maybe even their whole lives, in psychiatric institutions, and while some may end up in foster homes, it hardly goes smoothly. That's the real fantasy of the Werewolf Chronicles. Not the werewolves, but how smoothly Gruff is reintegrated into society, how happy his new family situation is right off the bat, how Gruff can not only magically understand English despite it being impossible to have learned it, but in just a week speaks English almost fluently. That social services thinks that the best option for a child like this is to leave him with a random family in bumfuck nowhere without any monitoring from anybody. And then the parents decide to put Gruff in public school because that's fucking smart, right? I could go on about this forever, but we're already going on long and I've barely started. So the town this takes place in is called Fox Hollow because Wolf Hollow would have been too easy, right? But wait, there's more. The central industry for this town is a shady company called Wolf Industries. That's WOLFE, Wolf Industries. Their main competitor is Undead Pharaoh Industries in the mummy-invaded town 20 miles away. So Gruff goes to school after just a week of getting used to a human existence, where he is naturally bullied, getting called Wolf Boy by some jerk named Rick. But even worse is the school principal, a wholly unpleasant man by the name of Mr. Clausen. Yeah, they just went there. Gee, I wonder if he's a werewolf or something. Also on the school staff is a Spanish teacher, Mr. Lycanthrope, home ec teacher, Miss Grrr, and the janitor, Steve I Will Eat You. Mr. Clausen immediately makes up a bunk reason to bring Gruff into his office where, well, see for yourself. On a big modern desk with clawed feet, a strange battered thing shaped like a metal head stared blindly at me, with slits where the eyes should be. Beside it was another weird object with 3 big screws. I shuddered and backed away. And the walls. At the Parker's house, the walls were covered with pretty pictures of the outdoors. But instead of pictures, Mr. Clausen had put up evil-looking weapons. In the center of the wall hung a big club with sharp metal spikes sticking out all over the end. The club had brown stains on the spikes and what looked like bits of hair. I leaned closer. It was hair. Do you think Mr. Clausen makes sure to hold all his meetings with parents in other rooms? Or are the adults of Fox Hollow too oblivious to realize that maybe a school principal that keeps medieval weapons and torture equipment, some of which that have been clearly recently used, might be a little weird? Though I will say, my old principal would have been a lot cooler if he had just put murder weapons on his walls. Mr. Clausen... Okay, look, he's Ripper from the first book. He's the most prominent nasty person in Fox Hollow, so obviously he's the most prominently evil of the werewolves. Let's not kid ourselves. So obviously he knows who and what Gruff is, so he pretends he's going to murder the kid right then and there with a club because... You know what, I don't know. I just don't know. In fact, I'd hardly say the middle portion of this book has much of a point at all. It mostly spins its wheels with Gruff going to school and being miserable, being at his new home and worrying about the werewolves, and the clock ticking down to the next full moon, when Gruff will be forced to transform again. The most interesting thing that happens in this middle portion of the book is when Gruff catches Kim sleepwalking outside. This feels like it's building up to something, like there's something supernaturally wrong with Kim. But like the crossbow in the last book, it's a setup with no payoff. Eventually, Gruff spies on Mr. Clausen's house and learns what everyone else figured out 20 tiny chapters ago, that he's a werewolf, and that he's Ripper. Mr. Clausen holds a meeting with the rest of the werewolves and reveals the plan to take all the Fox Hollow children in one go, though he doesn't divulge how. Gruff tries to warn people, but he's a boy raised by wolves in a town full of people who don't think it's weird that the school principal has a thumbscrew on his desk. The werewolf plan quickly becomes clear when all the kids in the school are stuffed into a bus for a surprise field trip out into the woods, because the adults at Fox Hollow are too thick to worry when none of their children come home on time, and are too stupid to complain about having their children let on a field trip without having them sign permission slips first. The bus is driven by another stupid name antagonist, the PE teacher Mr. Grunter, though that would seem to suggest he's more of a were-pig than anything else. Mr. Clausen / Ripper leads the bus in his car. When they get deep into the forest, everyone gets out and Mr. Clausen finds an excuse to lock Gruff up in the car. It's got child locks, but Gruff manages to circumvent them in about 3 paragraphs because he was raised by wolves and understands how cars work. As he runs to the forest, however, he runs out of time. See, tonight is the first night of the full moon, so he takes on his kinda werewolf form before he can save the children. But this turns out to be just the ticket, because while they would never listen to normal old Gruff, they will run away from a monster that, according to the cover art, looks like a cross between Eddie Munster and Batboy. So Gruff manages to get ahead of the kids and scare them back in the direction of the bus, having to save the bully Rick from the swamp in a clear save the cat moment. However, the werewolves show up in full force, and Gruff is the only thing standing between them and a bus full of snacks. That is until Gandalf and the Wolf Mother and a bitch load of real wolves show up and fight the werewolves until they retreat. If I had to put money down on a fight between the two, I'd probably pick the side that still had opposable thumbs, but what do I know? Gruff and Wolf Mother have a bittersweet reunion before they retreat into the woods, and the kids are safe. For now. Ending the book. Children of the Wolf certainly has a lot more going on in it than the first book. We're actually starting to see the plot of the whole thing, but it's really hard to take a book like this seriously when it won't acknowledge the ramifications of the things happening in it. I personally cannot support the notion of turn your brain off entertainment, which the Werewolf Chronicles very clearly are. And it's not like the idea here is unworkable. For example, why have Gruff raised by wolves at all if the book doesn't do anything with the wolves, and is just going to paint over the problems of having the main character being a feral child? If you're not actually going to use these ideas, then wouldn't it be simpler to just have Gruff's character be a normal foster child with an unknown werewolf lineage? That way you could have all this stuff with Gruff facing the challenges of adjusting to the Parker family, the stresses of moving to a new town with a new school, and hiding and investigating your werewolf secret, but without the bullshit Pocahontas language assimilation or the hilarious off-camera scene of Gruff trying to figure out how the fuck a toilet works. Not to mention free up a book to flesh out its plot, chapters, and locations more. But now it's time to move on. Tomorrow we actually figure out what the hell is going on with Book 3, The Wearing.